Hello, I'm Joe McFadden. I'm Joe McFadden, and I'm a very grateful alcoholic, and I've been sober since June 14th, 1993. And for that, I owe you all my life, and I'm very grateful to be here this evening. And I owe Alcoholics Anonymous my life, and every breath that I take is because of the life-saving program of Alcoholics Anonymous that I've found. And what I'd like to do today is share with you what I'm really, this isn't going to be a history lesson. You can go to AI and learn more than I could ever learn about this. It's going to be a sharing. I want to show you how the title page and the four forewords and the preface, um, how they have just been here uh, way before I was ever here. And I want to show how the four forewords describe my life long before I ever knew they even existed, and perhaps any of you ever knew they existed. And but before I start, I'd like to start with something funny. I saved a file. I printed out so I'd have a little bit of a structure to it. And I went to save BBBC, which is Big Book Boot Camp, and a title page and four forewords. There is, and I sent it to Jay and some of our other knuckleheads. We're on a morning text together, all those of us in Texas, and I'm coming to you from Galveston, Texas, Galveston Island, and it was really funny because the spell check was really very spiritual what it did. I had to correct it three times before it finally got right. So I said BBBC, which stands for, as I said, Big Book Boot Camp. And then it says title page and four forewords. And what it said the first time, FOUR, 4 rewards, instead of forwards. And then I corrected it and it auto corrected again to 4 rewards. And I thought about that and laughed. And then I realized I think that there's a lot of truth in what it said. And there's a lot of Freudian slip that it made that I think it's spiritually inspired those, because there are 4 rewards in there. And what I'd like to carry is I would like to share my experience with this and how it ties into us today. And sometimes when we're reading this, we'll take an academic approach. And I just, whenever we get to a certain part, I want to bring this up. This is an original first edition, first printing. This isn't a copy, this is the real deal. And that's what this is. This is an original first edition, first printing Alcoholics Anonymous textbook. And then we're going to be talking about the original 100 Drunks and how they had Ruth Hawk, who was Bill Wilson's secretary. She would mail out these letters, the Alcoholic Foundation, signed by Ruth Hawk, right there, to every one of them. The original 100 Drunks, what they did is a labor of love. They didn't know if this was going to work. They didn't know if they were going to be able to translate. They were doing this in order to save their own butts. They thought that they found out that they could carry this message, and in carrying this message, they themselves would stay sober. And one thing I'd like to say is, if you wanted to condense everything down, and you'd start right here, and this is my notes from when I went through, and we got the stamp, because in the old big books, the circle and triangle wasn't there. And we drew that, and it stood for unity, service, recovery, steps, traditions, concepts, mind, body, spirit. Page 19, home, occupation, and affairs. Now, they didn't have a big book when they wrote the big book. I'm just trying to paint a picture about what we're going to be covering and how forward thinking they were. They didn't have a big book, and they were just they were, there was a flying blind period. They didn't know what they were doing, but they wanted to be of service and help other people. And so this is really a kind of a big thing that they came up with. And so the title page, that's where the first promise is of the big book. And that's how many thousands of men and women have recovered. And it proclaims that this is our basic text. And you will find answers to 3 questions that is posed to you in the preface. And it says, if you have a drinking problem, well, you're going to have to ask yourself, do I have a drinking problem? Because that's where we need to get where, yeah, I have a drinking problem. And then it says, we want you to pause before reading the personal stories in the back of that big book and ask you 3 questions, because these 3 questions will be addressed and answered for us in this big book. Yes, that you say, when you're reading it, yes, that happened to me, or more important, yes, I've felt that way too, or the most important is, yes, I believe this program can work for me. And that's what we're going to find out when we get to the preface. Now, the other four words, the first one says, hey guys, we found something. We got something here. A bunch of us are staying sober. We don't know. We're trying to capsulize. It's evolving. And one thing to keep in mind is sponsorship is a big deal whenever we get to the second edition preface. There was no mention in the first 164 pages the word sponsor, but it is all over there. And it is evolved. It is evolved. They didn't have the internet when this book was, but the nature of alcoholism has stayed the same. Dr. Bob's son, Smitty, and his wife, Betty, were dear friends, and I've entertained them at my home many times and had Thanksgiving dinner for them here with me. And he sent me a book, and it's about that thick, and it's called The Slaying of the Dragon, and it's the history of alcohol treatment. And there's been a lot of things changed since the history of alcoholism. They used to put alcoholics in a ship and send it out and let them starve and drown. But here's the thing, the nature of alcoholism has never changed. And thank God, that's what this book deals with. So the forward to the first edition says, we found something. The second one says, hey guys, it still works. And then the third one says, it works for everyone that tries it. It isn't just a bunch of WASP, a bunch of white Anglo-Saxon white guys. We had a woman come in, Marty Mann, she got sober. And then the fourth edition come out and it says, hey, it still works today. Wow. I mean, we're so fortunate. And so whenever I look at this, the title page of Alcoholics Anonymous says one thing to me, is there is hope for the helpless, hopeless, good-for-nothing alcoholic. And when you read this book, you find out how the hope is for those who suffer from alcoholism, that you can be a hopeless, helpless, good-for-nothing alcoholic and be transferred into a hopeful, helpful, do-good-for-nothing alcoholic. And that's great news. That's incredible news. And notice what it doesn't say in there. It doesn't say we're a bunch of professionals, we're a bunch of therapists, we're a bunch of doctors. No, it says men and women who have recovered. There is no resume for God's grace. The word slip that was never used before until someone heard Bill Wilson in 1939 say this. Someone had slipped, and they said, "What do you mean?" He said he slipped from the grace of God. And the message that this big book brings is there is hope. This puts us in a position for the grace of God to rain down on us. And what I'd like to do is I'd just like to let you know a little bit about me, because we've got to understand who these people were that wrote what we're getting ready to study and go over, and where they were coming from. They were just like each and every one of us that come to the meetings, busted, disgusted, not to be trusted. We're sick and tired of being sick and tired, and we don't even trust you. We don't even want our sponsor to like us. We do things to push him away because we're afraid he's going to get to know us and hate us as much as we hate ourselves. And I'm going to end up hurting him the way that I've hurt every person in my life. But I'm driven under the lash of alcoholism in here. And Bill Wilson's mother was an osteopathic surgeon, and they got a divorce. And this was a horrible stigma, and he grew up being raised by his grandfather and grandmother. And this was a horrible stigma. He didn't have much to do with his dad or anything. And I relate to that. And the reason I'm bringing that up is I never met my father, my real father. And I was brought, and I suffered lots of things. My mother had me when she was 14, 15 years old. And I was told I was a mistake and stuff. And I always knew I was a mistake. I was a stutterer. I went to special ed. I never fit in. And whenever I got old enough, I got into sports, and the sports gave me confidence. And Bill was able to make a boomerang. He talks about, and he went to the war and stuff. And one day, these rich kids invited me over. They had a motorcycle and heard I could work on it. And I go over there, and I put this motorcycle chain on them for the rich kids with the Corvettes and the leather jackets and the cheerleaders. And we were going to go swimming in the rich kids' swimming pool. And then after I got that chain on, they all came out and, "Get out of here, you white trash stutter. You think we'd really have anything to do with you?" And if it was one or two of them, I'd have fought them, but there was a bunch of them, and I left. And I took a shortcut. And in that shortcut, I crossed over a cemetery. And I thought to myself, these people are dying and maggots are eating their body. They're dead. God hasn't given me the dignity. I'm still alive, but I got those same maggots eating my inside, my spirit. And I was just dead, and I was walking. And I felt like for the first time, these people really saw who I really was. I bought the lie, the ego, the slithering serpent in Eden. And as I was walking through, I cut through the woods, and I heard some hooping and hollering and laughing. And it was my two cousins, and they had stolen, broken into someone's house and got a bunch of beer, and they told me to drink it. And I drank it. And then all of a sudden, that altered the course of my life. And the intensity, duration, and frequency of that euphoric omnipotence that made me feel good got down and down and down till finally, what it used to do for me, it was doing to me. And so I got girlfriends, I got cars. I had to prove those guys wrong. And I had to prove to everybody. And I would drive by in a Corvette convertible and everything, but I always knew I was a lie. I always knew businesses, I'd do everything. And then I'd get married, I'd get a prettier girl than them and everything. But eventually I would always crash and burn. And there was no human power that could relieve me from that's alcoholism. And whenever I got there, that extreme contempt, disgust, and hatred for myself, that was a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body that they're talking about in the big book. You see, the absence of alcohol, the curse of alcoholism is sobriety. The absence of alcohol does not cure alcoholism, it makes it worse. It's like you got these 220-volt wires, and all of a sudden, whenever you drink, it coats them and they're no longer arcing. But then at the tail end of our alcoholism, there is no coating and they're just arcing. And what I like to say is when you remove the alcoholic from the alcohol, you remove the alcohol from the alcoholic, what you have left is the ick. And there's nothing left but that ick. And the doctor's opinion says where most of these 100 drunks, and particularly this one and the one that wrote this, Bill Wilson, is the doctor's opinion says that some of us make the supreme sacrifice rather than to go on fighting. And you see, that's where Bill was. Bill had been institutionalized 3 times before he got it. And he finally got it. And what was it that he got? Ebby, his sponsor, they didn't have that word then, brought him over a book, and it was William James' Varieties of Religious Experiences. And in chapter 10, there's a chapter there. And he was looking at every person that's had a bona fide, he was a Harvard doctor, and he was doing research, and he found out that every person that had a bona fide, true spiritual experience had 3 things in common. The first one was at depth ego deflation. The second one was that he appealed something not of himself, but greater than to himself. And then the third thing was they always seemed to flee. Now, I submit to you that Bill read that chapter 10 on religious conversions because everyone thinks that Bill Wilson's religious conversion was whenever his spiritual experience, whenever he said God in December 11th, 1934, when he was in Towns Hospital, he said, God, if you're there, reveal yourself. And the room lit up and he said, this is spirit, God showed up. I say that isn't his spiritual experience because every one of us had that. And I'll tell you how we had that. We had that, and mine usually went like this. Joe, the DA called, they're dropping the charges. The room lit up. I had a wonderful lightning experience. A cold wind blew it, but they always fled. You know what? I overreacted with this, but that's not what happened. What did Bill say? Was the embryo of Alcoholics Anonymous and the platform foundation I'm going to do this whole talk on. He said, suddenly the idea came to me, perhaps there are others that could benefit from this experience. From that shredding thread, you and I's destiny hung. Had he not had that, seconds and inches, we would all be on that ship going out there burning. Right there, I'm looking out at the ocean. We'd been on that ship dying right now. But something transpired there, you see. And what happened was Bill knew that he had to give this away in order for him to stay sober. So it says where we have recovered. And there's a lot of controversy with that word. And let me explain what that means. I suffer from alcoholism, not alcoholism. In 1980, I got shot. They took me to the hospital. They removed a slug and stitched me up. I have recovered from a bullet wound. But ladies and gentlemen, I am not bulletproof. And that's what we mean. Each day is a day we must carry out God's vision for us, and we perfect and enlarge our spiritual condition through constant work and sacrifice for others and how we may meet their needs. And that's what this whole book is about, being inconvenienced. What I'd like to do now is say that every one of these alcoholics, every one of them, they were not experts, they were defeated. My own failures is I've been to more therapy. I've been dipped, dunked, and sprayed. I've tried discipline. With me, after I quit drinking, things got worse. The problem wasn't the alcohol. That was my solution. And that solution was what made me an alcoholic. And that solution turned on me. My best friend turned on me, and I couldn't get there. And what was the problem? Is that the problem was that wherever Joe went with me. The first promise in this big book is it says that AA never asked me to believe it. It asked me to experience it. And I had to look at that first promise And I had to look at that second foreword. And it says 100 men and women in the first foreword. And the second one said 150,000. What happened? What changed? Nothing changed. Nothing changed. Zero changed. The message spread. Sponsorship was birthed. Recovery spreads by one alcoholic carrying hope to another. Now, what I'd like to do is go over to the foreword to the first edition. We've covered the preface now. We of Alcoholics Anonymous, I want to spend a moment on the word we. You know, the word we is so important. It's probably the most important message that this book has. You see, I got drunk, we stay sober. The nature of alcoholism is such that my ego only thinks about one thing: I, me, my. My definition of a spiritual experience is when I, me, my, through the 12 steps and the actions that ask us to take contrary actions to our emotional natures. It changing. We don't come to AA to change. If we could change, none of us would be here today. We come to AA to be changed. And what is changed is that I, me, and my all of a sudden becomes we, us, are. All of a sudden, I'm worried about you. All of a sudden, I'm thinking about how my actions are going to affect another person. That selfishness and self-centeredness, that is the root of Joe's trouble, all of a sudden is turned into an asset because now it's other-centered, God-centeredness. And instead of getting rather than giving, we become givers. And page 128, giving rather than getting becomes our guiding principle. We of Alcoholics Anonymous, we've found something here. That's the message in the foreword to the first edition. We found something. From a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body, we have recovered. And it says that we hope that these pages will prove so convincing that no further authentication will be necessary. In other words, you never have to drink again. Marty Mann got sent to the first AA meetings, and she came back to St. Elizabeth's Hospital, and she said, "Oh my God, we're not alone, you ladies. We're not alone. We found our people. We never have to drink again." First woman in Alcoholics Anonymous came here and she found hope. And that's something. And it says to show others precisely how we have recovered is the main purpose of this book. For them, we hope these pages will prove so convincing that no further authentication will be necessary. Many do not comprehend that the alcoholic is a very sick person. And there's a line in the big book, although he usually doesn't think so. And besides, our way of living has advantages for them all. You see, we're not just treating the alcoholic, we're treating his family. In helping the alcoholic that we meet, we may be helping someone who's going to sponsor our grandchild or our daughter or son. And this happened in my case. And then it talks about that none of them did this as a sole means of living. There weren't any professional therapists or counselors or two-headers then. They did it in addition, not in place of their advocation. And our alcoholic work is an advocation. And the traditions on the bottom of this page, before they ever, this is like 16 years before the traditions, 11 years before the traditions ever came out or were thought of, they're describing all 12 traditions in the bottom paragraphs and the next two paragraphs. And then it says, We shall be interested to hear from those who are getting results from this book. They didn't know what was going to happen, particularly from those who have commenced to work with other alcoholics. We should be like to be helpful to such cases. And remember that line in the big book, to be helpful is our only aim. And then if we go over to the second edition forward, there's a really, really good stuff in there. And before we get into that, I'd like to talk a little bit about sponsorship. For years, I thought my job was if I was going to be a sponsor, was to be a teacher and teach people. Now I know that my job is one thing. It's not to give information or education, because that doesn't change people. Experience does. See, experience does. What we found out is for years, I thought my job was to teach people. Now I know my job is to transmit hope. We come, there's a lot of dope dealers who come in AA. We become hope dealers. Our dark past becomes our greatest asset. We get in there. Listen, the more screwed up you were in your home group and the worst you were, the more places you get to invited to speak in Alcoholics. You'll travel the world. And all you do is say, hey, I did this, and I'm not real bright, but I did this and this happened. Wow. And they'll say, Jesus, if God did that for an idiot like that, what can he do for a genius like me? And that's wonderful. That's Alcoholics. Thus we grow, it says in the big book. And so it goes, and I'd like to point out, this was in 1955, and the first forward was in 1939. What happened in 16 years? 6,000 AA groups. 6,000. Get that, 6,000 AA groups in 16 years, and 150 recovered alcoholics. Jesus. Whoa. And this is some promising beginnings, they said. This is but a beginning. Only the augury of a much larger future. That spark in 1935 relieved Bill Wilson of his first obsession. And now I'd like to get into some of my favorite part about this is the history. And Bill Wilson was convinced they didn't have the steps. They had the four absolutes of the Oxford movement: absolute honesty, unselfishness, love, and purity. Absolute hope, H-U-O-P, absolute honesty, unselfishness, love, and purity. And that's what they went. And when they went, they would sit there. They didn't have the steps really. Earl T, you can say, you could look, and he went and but Bill wrote that, and he takes a lot of literary license to do that. This is what they believed. They believed, they were convinced, moral inventory, confession of personality defects, restitution to harmed, helpfulness to others, and the necessity of belief and dependence on God. That was before the steps, what they believed. And they were big on, and Bill's this is really, I want to point this out. Bill, prior to his journey to Akron, the broker had worked hard for over a year with many alcoholics on the theory that only an alcoholic could help an alcoholic, but he had succeeded in only keeping himself sober. I might point out, those of you who like baseball know that if you have 1,000 batting average, that means that every time you got up to bat, you hit a home run. And I submit to you, Bill Wilson's 12-stepping batting record was 1,000 because he stayed sober. That's as good as it gets. And if someone else gets sober, great. But Bill had some problems. He was going over saying, hey, I got goosed by the Holy Spirit. You need to get it too. And they go, get away from me. You're a quack. But here's what happened. He went and he's telling Lois, look, Lo, I worked with alcoholics while you're working. I haven't got one of them. A guy hung himself in our closet. Another guy burned our new couch. and one of them hit on you, and your friends are making fun of me because I'm just a hanger on here and everything. And I just feel horrible. And I got a deal where I'm going to be a proxy at this at making tires at this manufacturer, and I'll make an equivalent of like $300,000 in today's, it's like 250 euros. That's a lot of money. And I'll be able to get us back on our feet, and I've learned my lesson. So he goes there. He takes the train there, and here's Bill Wilson. He thinks he's really going to cut a fat cow. And the second day, it falls together because of a part, and there isn't anything going on, and it's out. It ain't happening. He calls Lois and says, "Lo, honey, it fell through. I need money to get back." And she goes, "Oh, geez, Bill, I can't help you. I haven't got any money. In fact, we're going from the pan to the fire. The justice of the peace is here, and all our furniture's on the sidewalk. We got evicted." From this shredding thread, our destiny hung. Bill Wilson is in the Mayflower Hotel, and I've stood in that hallway and I've been at that phone. What little money he had, he hears the clinking of the bar and all the laughter, and he could go in there and get a drink. But what's he do? He goes over to that payphone and he picks it up and he makes 9 phone calls, and he finally gets hold of someone. And he calls Dr. Bob, and he goes over there the next day, and Dr. Bob says, "Look, Henrietta and Anne, I'm going to meet with this guy for 15 minutes, and then you tell him I got a surgery that needs to be." 3.5 hours later, they're still talking. What happened? Bill got there, and he wasn't trying to preach. He was trying to reach. He was saving his own butt. Let's never lose sight of that. Dr. Bob's last address we call it the Gettysburg Address of Alcoholics Anonymous here in the States. They wheeled him up in 1950 at the first conference, and they wheeled him up, and he was on a stretcher his last few weeks alive, and he got up there. And he said, "Our 12 steps when simmered down comes down to 2 words, love and service. And let's watch that ever airy member of the tongue. And if we must use it, let's use it with kindness." And then he sits down and he says, "Thank you very much. You'll have to forgive me, but I've been very, very sick." And they put him on the wheelchair, taking him back to his gurney to haul him back to die. And he says, "Oh, one more thing." And they wheel him back up there, and he barely stands up. And he says, "None of us, let's not forget, none of us would be here had it not been for the kind, thoughtful little deeds that meant so much to us, that none of us would be here had somebody not done that. That in and of themselves, they aren't any big deals, but they saved our lives. Let's not get the air of complacency and smugness that we fail to even try." And that's the message. That's the language of the heart. That's what this book is carrying. This is what all the forewords, this is what the message of Alcoholics Anonymous is. So Bill went, and he believed that Dr. Silkworth's description of alcoholism is hopelessness, and he began to pursue the spiritual remedy, and we covered that. The very first case was a desperate one. When Dr. Bob, he went and he went out, he got drunk once, and he came home, and Bill said, "This isn't even working for Dr. Bob." And Bill had to give him a highball, a screwball, and give him a drink. They took him over, and he was a proctologist. He had to do surgery. How'd you like to be that patient? And then Bill brought him back, and then he had to go for and He met with Ann and said, listen, I'm going to go back. I'm going to hitchhike, whatever I got to do to get back to New York. And Dr. Bob never came back Sunday night from that medical convention. They knew he was drunk. Finally, they see this tall, lanky guy coming in, and they knew that he was drunk, and he came in. And they said, where you been? And they smelled his breath. He hadn't been drinking. He said, I went around and I told everybody that I had a drinking problem. And from this moment on, I'm no longer going to drink, and I'm going to help others find a solution. And the next morning he got up and he said, hey, Willie boy, if you and I are going to stay sober, we best get busy. Now, on page 179, it talks about in the big book, it talks about something very, very, very important that Dr. Bob, it's 174. He says, what did this man say or do that was different from what others had said and done? It must be remembered that I had a great deal of knowledge, more than him, on the subject of alcoholism. He said, I had been trying to employ, that is, the spiritual approach, and it never worked for me. He said, Bill gave me information about the subject of alcoholism, which is undoubtedly useful. But he said, of far more importance was the fact that he was the first living human being with whom I had ever talked who knew what he was talking about in regard to alcoholism from actual experience. In other words, he talked my language. He knew all the answers, and certainly not because he had picked them up in reading. You see, we knew all this, but we didn't know we knew all this. And now, if you were to go to Appendix 3 on page 186, it's going to talk about Dr. W.W. Bauer and the medical estimate of alcoholism. And he says that there, that Alcoholics Anonymous are no crusaders. In other words, we're not going to get over there and talk about being goosed by the Holy Spirit. Bill didn't get a single person sober doing that. He says they're not a temperance society. If you want to drink, that's your business. Go for it. Bop till you drop. If you need help, we're here. Good luck. If it works for you, we'll make you president. Come back and tell us. But it didn't work for us. Here's what did. He said they know they must never drink. They help others with similar problems. In this atmosphere, the alcoholic often overcomes his excessive concentration upon self, learning to depend upon a higher power and absorb himself in his work with other alcoholics. He remains sober day by day. The days add up into weeks, the weeks into years. That's Alcoholics Anonymous. They had the answer and didn't know they had the answer. Isn't that cool? And the big thing isn't about education or information. It's about identification. You hear people in meetings all the time, and most of them are drunk. Well, you know, it doesn't say just alcoholics. It does say just alcoholics. One alcoholic working with another alcoholic. We tried to carry this message to alcoholics and practice these principles in all of our affairs. One alcoholic working with another alcoholic to remove that feeling of difference just enough to take actions that you never would have ever before, because you believe that this person believes it worked for him. You don't even have to believe it'll work for you. All you have to do is that contempt, pride, or investigation quote. You try it and prove to us it won't work for you. It worked for us. And every person, AA cannot, will not, never has, never will, and it's absolutely impossible to fail for every person that takes these actions. Now, what I'd like to go over and talk about is they went over to Bill Dotson, AA number 3. This guy was a lawyer. He ran for mayor of Akron, and he broke a nurse's nose, and he felt horrible. Great guy, but when he drank, he became a raving lunatic. And he walked in there, and Dr. Bob and them, and there's something that they had. And my sponsor, Jim Willis, got sober February 6, 1957. He did the same thing. He says, I'm going to ask you a question, and this is a non-starter for me. It's a yes or no. You either are going to do this or you're not. He says, hey, go in and say, are you willing to quit drinking for good and all? we have a solution if you are. If there's any pause, they'll go get somebody else. And he says, yes. And they sat there for 5 hours talking to Bill Dotson. And they said, well, if you want, we'll come back the next day. The next day, I heard a tape of him talking. He comes back, and there's his wife. And he says, look, Mom, those are those guys. I ain't ever going to drink again. They know about it. There's a solution. And he never drank again that day in his life. That's all we have to do. We couldn't. Pop Doyle in San Antonio used to say, that SOB'd rather tell a lie when the truth would be better. You don't got to tell a lie. You go there and just say what's happened inside of you. That's all you need to know. And you say, this book right here, the story of how many hundreds of men and women have recovered. And so he got out there and he started carrying, this is the new light that entered the dark world of alcoholism. And these men entered the flying blind period of Alcoholics Anonymous. And each inquiry was painstakingly answered. Look at this. Ruth Hawk, Bill Wilson's secretary, they sent these out. You had to pay like $12, a lot of money for this book. It was a lot of money back then. And they would get that book and they would write and they'd say, could you mail me one? Here's a check. And they would mail it. And then they would write. Look at that. That's a typewriter, isn't it? A computer. They worked their tails off. And then what happened is this Jack Alexander with the Saturday Evening Post, he thought that this was a scam to make money. So his editor sent him over there to go behind the lines of Alcoholics Anonymous. Now get this, from this shredding thread our destiny hung. Jack Alexander goes into a meeting and there was his old neighborhood drunk from the neighborhood he grew up. He says, oh God. He looks at this guy and this guy was chairing the meeting and had a change. And he said, my God, there's something here. And he wrote a wonderful article about Alcoholics Anonymous. Chuck Chamberlain, his wife Elsa, and Ernest Holmes sent him to Alcoholics Anonymous because his church, a Church of Religious Science that he was a founding member of, couldn't get him sober through the healing treatments. And this opened it up like crazy. But now let me share this. And I have a wonderful story about this. It says the test then, because it just took off. I mean, we're going to 1 million members now. It says the test that it faced was this: could these large number of erstwhile erratic alcoholics successfully meet and work together? Would there be quarrels over membership, leadership, and money? Would there be strivings for power and prestige? Would there be schisms which would split apart? We had to unify our fellowship or pass off the scene. And then they describe the traditions again before they had the traditions. Now, get this. I was speaking up in West Virginia at their state conference one year. And the week before I had to get over there, Bob Darrell's sponsor called and wanted me to come visit him. And it was Dick Tucson. And a lot of y'all have met Dick. And I know Robert's on here and he's met him. And I go over there. Dick is in a hospice and he wanted to see me. And I go there and I hug him and we're talking and everything. And I said, Dick, I just want you to tell me the story. And he told me the story again. And I said, all right, wonderful. And I hugged him. And then I got on the plane and I went to West Virginia. And the person that was hosting me was a guy named Bob McAteer. And he told me, he says, I was the chairman of the delegates the year that Bill Wilson died in New York. I said, you've got to be kidding me. I just left the alternate chairperson in Las Vegas. He's in hospice, and I saw him, and he told me something, and I wanted to bounce it off you. He says, well, are you talking about Dick Tucson? I said, yes. He says, is he still alive? I haven't talked to him since 1970 when Bill died. And we had to make a decision because the New York Times was coming out with a headline about Bill Wilson dying. And if we wanted to have a say in it, we all had to get together, and all the delegates rushed there and they were having a meeting and they were fist fighting and everything. And he says, yeah, all that's true. And I got to call Dick and Bob talked, and just tears came down and we were all crying. And the stories is that Dick Tucson was up there and Clarence Snyder said, did you get everything out of that SOB? Clarence Snyder and Bill hated each other and said, I'm ready to take my rightful place in Alcoholics Anonymous history. And Dick Tucson, I cannot repeat what he told him before he hung up on him. And they were all there. And when we take erstwhile erratic alcoholics and emotionally immature alcoholics, this is what was going on. We had your Class A alcoholics and your class members of the General Service Office, the trustees, and then you had your Class B, the boozers. And the Class A trustees were saying, we cannot turn it over to a bunch of erstwhile emotional erratic alcoholics. There needs to be grown-ups in the room. And the alcoholics are saying, no, hell no, our life depends on this. This is our life. We need to do it. And they were fighting, and they had to get a decision made. And Dick Tucson and Bob McAteer were sitting at that head table. Then all of a sudden, in this screaming, almost fist fight room in New York, this elderly, old gray-haired lady walks in. And as she walks down the center aisle where everyone's screaming, a hush fell upon the room. I'm sorry, I get touched up telling this. And she goes over there and she puts one hand on Bob McAteer's shoulder and her other hand on Dick Tucson's. And she leaned over in between them and whispered, boys, can I have the floor for a moment? And they said, yes. She goes, listen, guys, I know Dr. Bob's gone. I know that Bill's gone. And we don't know if Alcoholics Anonymous is going to be here anymore. She goes, but I assure you, I've seen a lot in Alcoholics Anonymous history, and Alcoholics Anonymous isn't going to be here a minute longer than God wants it to be here, and God wants it to be here. She goes, I've seen God, lots of things come and go in Alcoholics Anonymous, and I know there's a lot of us versus them right now going on. She goes, but this unity of Alcoholics Anonymous must be preserved. And a little sidebar, if you went to the doctor and he said that you have disunity, you have stage 4 cancer and you're going to die. The spiritual cancer is disunity in Alcoholics Anonymous. And she goes, listen, there is no us versus them in Alcoholics Anonymous. I ought to know this. My name is Lois Wilson. In Alcoholics Anonymous, there is only us. And she says, I'm sure you fellas will get it figured out. And she turned around and walked out. There wasn't a dry out in that room. And they figured it all out. Now, ladies and gentlemen, that's the world of the spirit. This is our legacy. This is our legacy. Our chain in the link of Alcoholics Anonymous. This is ours. What are we going to do with it? This isn't just printed stuff. This is real. They worked their tails off getting this. And we're going to go into our home group and bitch about the way somebody, how dare us? There is no us versus them. There is only us. We need to wake up to that. And I'm sorry, you might know I'm passionate about Alcoholics Anonymous. And it talks about there's no, we cooperate, not, and I just want to say something. We don't take statistics in Alcoholics Anonymous. We don't know. If you were to go and where they got on page XVI, where they got to 50% sobered up immediately, 25 eventually, and the other 25 showed remarkable and came back over time. If you were to go and see Bill's personal big book, which is over at the Wilson House, and you were to look at the personal stories that they had, they wrote down he stayed sober, he slipped but came back. It comes up to the actual 75. The things that are in the big book aren't true because they're in the big book. They're in the big book because it's true. Here's my experience. When I met Mark Houston and Joe Hawk, and we started a group called the Truth Seekers, and it was based on the doctor's opinion that at a certain point, an alcoholic cannot distinguish the true from the false. Mark had just had a nervous breakdown over a divorce he had, and his PTSD came back. Joe had just gotten out of the Pennsylvania prison, and they were sober though, and I had just gotten out of 81 days in the Texas State Insane Asylum, 37 days shock treatments, and we were all sitting around and saying, is this true in the big book, and how do we know? We're not interested in anyone's opinion on experience they haven't ever had. And so what happened was people saw that I was taking the steps and saw a big change in me. And so we started the Steel on Steel. That's another story. But we started this Truth Seekers group. There were 81 people that were sponsorous with societal throwaways, as was I. And they saw a change that had transpired within me. And we thought it was a waste of time to study the big book and reading the big book. Were both waste of time unless we were going to do what was in the big book. And so what we did is the 81 of us, we met twice a week, and everything that was in the big book, we ask, is this true, and what is our experience? And if we had no experience, we would come back the next week after practicing, and we would all compare notes. Now, the reason I went through that whole heading about that was this, is that there were 81 of us. And ladies and gentlemen, today, there are 67 of us still alive and sober or died sober. Now, if you were to take that 67 and 81, that's 75%. It is in the big book because it is true. It's not true because it's in the big book. Don't knock it till you try it. And so the other parts, and no, am I, what time do I need to turn it off? How much time? Just tell me. I can.
You're got over slightly, Joe, but we're not that strict. So if you want, you take another 5 minutes and wrap it up.
Okay, I'll wrap it up. Um, what I'd really just like is I'd just like to say that Alcoholics Anonymous works for anybody. AA cannot, will not, never has, never will, and is absolutely impossible to fail. And what I'd like to say is that I'm one of the people they're talking about in the 4 Forewords and the preface and the title page. I was a hopeless, helpless alcoholic. And I'll wind it up with this, and I want to read one paragraph, which is my swan dive out of here. Is I say, Dear God, please show me something new I've been wrong about and give me more opportunities to be inconvenienced. And I got that prayer from the first two sentences in the 12 and 12 step 5. All of AA's 12 steps asks us to take actions that go contrary to our emotional desires. They all deflate my ego. My ego has one job, separate me from three things, and it only has one toolkit, one tool in that, and that's fear. Fear I'm going to lose something I have or not get something that I want. And it's going to separate me with that tool of fear from three things: God, myself, and others. And what I do whenever I say, God, please show me something new I've been wrong about every day for the last 33 years, is that Joe McFadden can rest satisfaction if only Joe McFadden manages well. And as many of you know, I get between 20 and 30 phone calls, and people from Al-Anon and AA are coming in and out of Lucy and mine's home, inconveniencing the heck of us. And thank God it keeps me out of my management seat. And I thank y'all for that. And with that, I just want to close. When I came to Alcoholics Anonymous, I thought I needed to recover from drinking. But over time, I've discovered I needed to recover from Joe. The alcohol was only a symptom. The loneliness, the fear, control, pride, and the endless self-centered thinking were the real prison. The forewords don't simply introduce a book, they introduce a promise. They tell us that ordinary, hopeless people found a way out. I stand before you as one more witness that this promise is still true today. My recovery didn't begin when I stopped drinking. It began when I stopped believing I could save myself and become willing to let God do for me what I could never do alone. The miracle of Alcoholics Anonymous is just this. The greatest miracle wasn't that I quit drinking. The greatest miracle was that I don't have to live inside the prison of Joe, and neither do you. Thank you all very much.